Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Mark Claude. I'm the CEO of Commonwealth Commercial Partners, and I can't believe this is our 10th forum. I'm very appreciative of everybody in attendance today. We strive hard to find topics and speakers that challenge us and engage us, hopefully make us better real estate practitioners. I think today will be more of the same, and really looking forward to that. A couple things before we kind of get started. One is I want to recognize some individuals who did the heavy lift to kind of help put all this together, and please hold your applause until I read the names. But Kristen Cole, Sally Pruitt, Roberta Vaya, Leah Ziegler, Paul Denton, Bailey Foster, a few more that I can't remember, but thank you all very much for pulling all this together. So I also wanted to make a special announcement relative to our brokerage group. We have a group of professionals from Harrison Bates that will be joining us at the end of May, and I wanted to share that with this group. But those individuals are Steve Gentle, David Williams, Kit Tyler, Bruce Milam, Chip Louthan, and Colton Convicka. So welcome to our family. It's a great addition. And so lastly, I just want to turn the agenda over to one of our long-term supporters, Troutman Sanders. They've been a great partner, and here to kick off the forum is one of their top real estate attorneys, Will Homiller. Will?
Great. Thank you, Mark. Welcome, everyone, to the 10th Annual Commercial Real Estate Forum. My name is Will Homiller. I'm a partner with Troutman Sanders here in Richmond. Troutman Sanders has been a proud sponsor of this event for many years now. My job here is to welcome you and to remind you to turn off your cell phone ringers. So if you could just take a quick minute to do that, I'd appreciate it. We have an outstanding program ahead of us here. I had the pleasure of going to the Hampton Roads version of this event, which had its inaugural event yesterday, and was able to hear our speaker, and I know you have a big treat in front of you here today. I would also like to announce our sponsors. You will see their logos on the screen throughout today's event. First two that we'll mention, obviously, Commonwealth Commercial Partners and LINGERFELT Commonwealth Partners. Also as sponsors, we have my firm, Troutman Sanders. We've got Kiter, Atlantic Real Estate Capital, Marsh & McLennan Agency, also known as Rutherford, Wells Fargo, Sauer Properties, Baskervill, the Greater Richmond Partnership, and West Creek. So thank you to all our sponsors who helped make this event possible. Just as a reminder, at the end of the event, there will be a reception just outside these doors here, which will give us an opportunity to network with each other and speak more with our guest speaker, Ms. Valencia. At this point, I'd like to turn the microphone over to John Wick with the Private Bank for Greater Virginia Region with Wells Fargo.
Thank you, Will, and good afternoon. On behalf of Wells Fargo team members in the Richmond area, we're pleased to be the sponsor for this year's wonderful forum. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. As I look around the room, and I know that there are many different industries represented here today, we certainly have something in common. We all care about this community, and we have a passion around it. Just like everyone here today, Wells Fargo is committed to making Virginia's communities a better place to work, live, and play. At Wells Fargo, we call ourselves teammates, and we sincerely feel that way. That way, we are a team dedicated to communities where our bank branches serve our customers. So in addition to being here as a representative of Wells Fargo, the proud sponsor of the 10th Annual Commercial Real Estate Forum, I'm excited about the opportunity to get to know some of you better later on this afternoon and today as we talk. At Wells Fargo and the private bank, we strive for those deep relationships. We want to be a part of our community success, and there's own definition of what that means for a better community. Team members are coupled with company-led initiatives like grant, corporate philanthropic giving, and forging partnerships with nonprofits, organizations like those to help build a better community. Last year, Wells Fargo donated over $6 million to the Virginia communities. Through corporate and foundation giving, as well as volunteerism, generosity of our team members, Wells Fargo is invested in Central Virginia. Our team members in our company work hard to make our community financially more viable because we believe we are only as successful as the community we serve. This afternoon, I also have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Catalina Valencia, who brings over 19 years of professional experience in different facets of economic development. She has had the opportunity to work on projects in an array of industries: agribusiness, petrochemical, chemical, consumer products, paper products, metallurgic composites, and aerospace, etc. And learn about the key drivers of location decision processes. Recently, Catalina created her own site selection economic development consulting firm, TerraFinder Consulting. Before establishing her own company, Catalina worked as a senior consultant at Global Location Strategies, where she consulted on capital resource-intensive projects representing over $1.5 billion in capital investment and 1,300 new jobs. Some of the economic development clients include Duke Energy, Tennessee Valley Authority, South Carolina Power Team, Eastman Business Park. She has led many global marketing, business development, and international development roles with various companies. I think we're in for a real treat today. Will you please welcome Catalina Valencia? Thank you.
Good afternoon. How is everybody doing? Good. So thank you very much for being here this afternoon. Thank you very much to Commonwealth Commercial, to Mark, to Kristen, and very special thanks to Kristen for all the hard work in putting together this event. I'm very excited to be here. And before we get started, I would like to see what representation we have here in terms of different types of groups. So for example, where are the brokers? Okay. Where are the attorneys? CPAs? Economic developers? Okay. Wealth management? Who am I missing? Real estate investors. How am I missing that? Real estate owners. It's the same group. Anybody else I'm missing that we have here today? Well, again, very excited to be here, and thank you very much for being here this afternoon. So, standing out from the crowd, getting on the map for corporate site selection. Many times, communities, and more often these days, are evaluated without that community even knowing it. Many times, communities are shortlisted or are cut, and they didn't even realize they had been considered. In the site selection process, driven by the faster pace of the business environment, the need to be able to walk the walk with our customers and be able to adapt our processes to their time frames, we've had to streamline our processes as well. We've had the need of becoming more cost and resource efficient. So with that, we are doing a lot more at the desktop level these days than going into the communities from the beginning. In the first phases of the site selection process, we are doing much more research and relying much more on public information sources. So we've had different types of sources, from public information, from memberships, from proprietary resources, to the information that is available through the economic development organizations. But there are downsides to using public available data. It's historic, we have lagging indicators, sometimes we just don't have complete data for the entire business spectrum. For example, we don't have a lot of data available on services and what's happening in terms of business attraction into the business sector. So there are downsides to the process, but still, we are doing a lot of work at that level of relying on those sources to be able to form an opinion at the high level about the communities we are trying to target. So what I did is, from the eyes of the site selector and relying entirely on publicly available data, I tried to look at the Richmond region. And I looked not only at the greater Richmond region, but also to the area, the economic area, where Richmond is the center of, which is a much larger geographic area. And since I didn't have a specific project at hand, what I tried to do is get an idea of what the data told me about Richmond, what the data told me about what are your strengths and what type of industries you are good at. So I ran an analysis of industries, and I tried to understand where your industries were located in the business cycle. So I tried to understand whether sectors were in the STAR segment. Those are industries that you have a high concentration in, and also that concentration is growing when you compare it to national standards. Whether you had some segments of industries more in the mature phase, and those are industries that you have very high concentration in, but that concentration has been, that the growth in the concentration is diminishing. Or whether you had some industries transitioning, meaning industries for which you don't have a large concentration, and that concentration is not growing. So most likely, those industries are going to be phasing out. And then you have the emerging ones. And those are industries for which you may not have a high concentration today, but that concentration is growing over time. So even though they may not be a very large part of your industrial makeup or your business makeup, they may become stars in the future. So with that, usually you would want to concentrate on those industries or those clusters where you are a star or you are emergent. So I came down to a number of industries being stars. So you see there some in the financial services, vulcanized and fire materials. Probably some of those may seem strange to you. I'm not going to read the entire list, but these were the ones that came up as star industries for Richmond, or the economic area. And that means that these are industries in which you have a high concentration, and that concentration has been growing over time when you compare it to the US. Then you have a group of emerging industries, and these ones probably, they just represent a very small portion of your business, but the concentration they have compared to national numbers, it's growing over time. And again, these may become your stars in the future. So I looked at that list of star and emerging industries. And I also looked at, okay, where there are sectors in here that probably are more local and are more for example, you have the performing arts sector, or you have livestock processing where there are some environmental concerns around that industry. Communications equipment, it's more local than an industry that you would think it's exported, or where you have the possibility of exporting services or exporting products. So you would want to concentrate and think of your region as a region that is full of industries and businesses that are exportable. Businesses where you can grow by also tapping into other markets. So with that, I went through the process of looking through that list and determining, which ones probably are more valuable in terms of the capacity to export. And of course, you need to have that infrastructure, that support infrastructure to continue growing. I also looked at what significance that the industries had in terms of the industrial makeup at the national level. So just understanding from those lists of star and emerging industries where Richmond has great opportunities, looking how big they are and what type of opportunities or how big of the opportunities you can get from this type of industry. So understanding their relative position within all of the industry grouping. I looked as well at growth performance. So how have those industries grown over the past 5 years? And just seeing some trends there. So, for example, in the oil and gas production sector, that's also very localized. That's a very local sector. It's more the pipeline work, the pipeline infrastructure. So it, of course, serves a good segment of the industry, but it's also something that you need to have locally. It's not something for which you'll be looking for site or projects to come to the area to install pipelines. It doesn't happen that way. So in that way, I went through and started sifting through the list of industries just to come down to industries that presented great opportunity for Richmond, which the data was showing me Richmond has good possibilities or good opportunities in. So I also looked at the outlook. So not only looking at the past and how industries have grown, but also looking at how those industries may grow into the future, what opportunities may exist out there. So with that, I also went across the industries that I started screening, determining which ones presented a better outlook in the years to come. So with that, I came to 5 overarching industries where Richmond appears to be strong or have opportunities into the future. So one is the food processing and manufacturing segment, which is a standalone segment, aerospace, vehicles, and defense, corporate services, and here is the financial services that I'm putting it into that fintech segment, and in there or under there, you have business services and marketing and those type of services that support businesses. You have under light industry, medical devices, lighting and electrical equipment, and you have in heavy industry, you have the plastics and production technology and heavy machinery. In looking at the potential, at the outlook for these industries, I also took into account all the transformations that are happening across the topic of technology adoption and the topic of Industry 4 and how companies are starting to implement these changes. So not only internally companies changing their processes, changing their machineries, changing their equipments, but also companies that need to manufacture those components to be able to help build and transform the industries of the future. So I also looked in that outlook which industries were better poised to take advantage of all those transformations. So these were the ones that the data, and after all that process of screening and evaluation, showed me Richmond had a good opportunity into the future. Again, desktop level data is very limiting. It's very limiting not being able to have the perception of what's happening in the market because, again, you have a lot of entrepreneurial activity. You have a lot of things that are happening today that don't get captured by data. And many times, those data releases publicly, they happen 1 year, 2 years from now, many times 5 years from now for some of the big surveys. And when we get to look at, we are looking at data from 2 years before or 5 years before. We are not getting to see what's happening in your communities today. So if you tell me that your community is bubbling with entrepreneurial activity and with technological changes, at the desktop level, I won't be able to see that if the data is not showing it to me. So again, coming down to, through that process of screening, these were the industries that popped up. And I compare that to what industries is Richmond targeting. So going to the Greater Richmond Partnerships website, you see on the left-hand side the industries that the Richmond area is targeting, and then on the right-hand side, the industries I came down to. And you see there are some commonalities. The corporate service segment, you have Greater Richmond is targeting finance and insurance. That's how they are calling it. I'm calling it fintech. The food processing is there. And then there is a segment that I can categorize under that advanced manufacturing segment that the Greater Richmond Partnership is targeting. And those are plastics, production technology, and heavy machinery, and aerospace and defense. But there are a group of industries that I found out through the data, medical devices and the lighting and electrical equipment, that I don't see how to group them under any of those groupings that the Greater Richmond Partnership is targeting. And also there are some that are being targeted by the Economic Development Partnership that I didn't find on, or I found, but in a different life cycle of the process. So that either tells me these are aspirational targets, which is fantastic, but also you cannot stop at aspiration. You need to be able to build the infrastructure to support the growth of these industries. So I had the opportunity this morning of talking a little bit more with friends from the Greater Richmond Partnership and understanding a little bit more why is it bioscience, for example, or supply chain are being targeted. And in my research, what the data was showing me is that those were industries that were either in the mature phase or were transitioning. And I got an explanation for it, and it was that at this point, there is a need for product around these industries. So it somehow confirmed why in the data it was showing that these industries didn't have a very good position, but in the aspiration and the goal of the region, it is to target them. So my message to you is you need to build the infrastructure to be able to grow these industries. So those were the industries I came down to by looking at the data. Not looking at anything else, just looking at what the data from 3 years ago, 2016, showed me. What are the drivers for those 5 big encompassing or overarching sectors? So I'm going to be talking to you in the next few minutes a little bit more about that. So when we look at the corporate services and fintech, they are different things, but I grouped them for the purpose of talking about main drivers, just because I think that the underlying needs of those two industries are very similar. So what do they try or what do they look for when looking for a location? Workforce, infrastructure, quality of life, cost of doing business. Those are some of the key components of their site selection process. So in terms of workforce, what do they look for? Not only highly skilled workers, but they also look for cost savings in those highly skilled workers. So if you have a location, which I see Richmond has that potential, where you have very qualified workers, but at the same time, you have savings because you have other regions that are competing in this segment that are much more expensive, the cost of living is higher, then Richmond has an edge in being able to compete in these industries. Because despite the fact that they are driven by high-tech or highly skilled people, they also need to meet their bottom line. Infrastructure, again, is very important. In the region, in the area, and at the sites where these companies are going to be at. We are talking a lot about downtown locations, but you also find that these companies are looking for industrial parks where they can have savings and they can also have access of the community. Direct airline flights to California. It's very important. A lot of these industries, a lot of what's happening in these industries, especially fintech or information technology or high-tech industries, is happening, is being funded, is being decided in places like California or other places around the world. So being able to have that connectivity is very important. Utilities, and here, of course, electricity, water, all of those are very important, but telecommunications is key. Quality of life. I think that's a very important component for these industries. You are looking for highly skilled workers, mostly people that in these days would want to live nearby the downtown areas and want to enjoy more free time, more quality time. So you need to look not only for the entertainment options, but you also need to look for health access, for transportation. Is it easy to move around the city? For quality of education, for how costly it is to buy a home in that community. So all of these aspects are important, and all of these aspects are being evaluated when handling these type of projects. And costs, of course, are very important. So here are a couple of examples of successful locations today in the fintech market especially. You have Charlotte, that traditionally has been in the banking business it's one of the large hubs in the US, and they've been able to transition into the fintech area. Detroit also has been able to capitalize with Quicken Loans, for example, and some other ones that have followed on their steps to be able to capitalize in a lower cost environment and be able to help grow the city as well, anchoring or around this business. Salt Lake City is another one that has been attracting a lot of millennials over the past few years, and they've also been able to grow into the fintech business. So those are a few of the examples. So when we think about moving on from the fintech, the corporate business or the corporate services area, and you move on to aerospace and defense, the project drivers change. Of course, we are talking about different types of projects. We are talking about products that are different. We are talking about needs that are different. And traditionally, in aerospace, the ones that make a lot of noise are those large projects. But 90% of aerospace projects are, for the most part, small, medium-sized projects. So what is important to aerospace projects? The workforce component, skilled workforce at different levels of the organization, very important for aerospace. You have some examples there on types of position. Quality of life and cost of living for the employees is key. Logistics, very important for aerospace. Access to air, ocean transportation hubs and ports for transporting components, materials, large pieces of components for airplanes. Ground transportation is important, rail, proximity to interstate, and then long-term incentives and tax structure. Aerospace is one of those industries for which incentives, but long-term incentives are very important. So this is a region that has been doing very well in the aerospace space over the past years. The US Southeast, so South Carolina with Boeing, you have Alabama, and I think reasons for that success rely on the proximity to port, the highway system in these areas. When you compare this region to other more traditional aerospace regions in California, for example, you have lower costs of not only living, but lower costs of doing businesses. So I think this has been a great factor into attracting aerospace as well. Incentives have been a big component in attracting these industries to these areas in the Southeast. Right-to-work laws, when you compare to locations in California, for example, and the military presence. Aerospace projects, they take a good advantage of your military presence, having air bases, having people that are retiring from those air bases or from those military hubs, and that can transition into these aerospace operations. That's key, and you have that nearby. So you do have an advantage with already the presence of military here in the area. So now let's move on and think about food processing. Let me stop for a minute here and just around what we've talked so far, is there anything that for any of you is contradicting, is something you hadn't seen, hadn't expected, or pretty much these are things that you were familiar with and they don't sound that strange to you? I'll take that as, yeah, you are on the right path. So thank you. When we think about food processing and manufacturing, we gotta think about the rapid changes that are happening. Rapid changes are happening everywhere. But the food industry is one of those where we are seeing a lot of change in our habits. People are changing the way they consume food at home. And that also is bringing transformation into production processes and into how communities need to target food industry projects. So, for example, flexibility is key. Food industry companies are being called to be able to change very quickly their processes. They are being called to be able to change ingredients, to change packaging, to change their processes around their plant, to be able to adapt to these different products that they'll need to be targeting the new needs in the market. So in terms of product, having flexible buildings where you have the column spacing, you have the clear heights, you give the company the opportunity to make those flexible moves in their production processes is key. So flexibility, not only in how we approach the site selection process, but also in how we build our product or the type of product that we have for attracting this industry is very important. For the most part, food industry projects, they are small projects, most of them, and they look for existing buildings. But in the places where you don't have existing buildings, having a green field that it's very well characterized and where a lot of that due diligence has been done can also provide opportunities for you. Transportation logistics, key for food industry. So truck transportation is vital. You need to have very well access to interstate highways, 4-lane highways, in opportunities have access to railroad. I did work with the Eastman Business Park a couple years ago, and one of the industries that they are targeting is the food industry. And there is one operation there. You think of Rochester, New York, and you think of California, and that's pretty far away. And the park has rail service. And what this company is doing, they serve all of the Northeast market, all the Wegmans, all of the grocery stores in the area, and they bring tomatoes from California into Rochester to their plant. And then they can them, they process them, and then they distribute that to Wegmans and others. So rail sometimes is important as well. Presence of existing cluster in town, having other food processing operations is key. And then this is a good example of, or I have several examples here, but I won't go into detail. You have Tampa, Florida, you have Bismarck in North Dakota, you have Oswego County in New York. Those are examples of communities that are growing and are taking advantage of their logistics and natural advantage in terms of access to ingredients and raw materials. So for the most part, in these regions, when you look across them, you see there are a couple common denominators. Number one, they have a logistical advantage of some sort. They are either at the crossroads of two important roads that lead to many markets, or they have port access that allow them to be able to get product or dispatch product to other markets. So in the case of Tampa, for example, they have the port of Tampa, and that's the U.S. port that is the closest to Central America. So that's an opportunity that the Tampa people are starting also to target, is bringing product, exporting product to Central America. Another important component is the access to ingredients. So they are tapping into the opportunities that they have from their very strong agricultural sector to be able to process those ingredients, those products that are being produced locally at the agricultural level, taking advantage of that, processing them into final products, into final food products, and bringing that to the market. In biopharmaceuticals, some of the transformation and where we are with biopharmaceuticals, has been driven by the growth of biopharmaceuticals from the very early stages when the industry started. When drugs started to be developed and biopharmaceutical companies started to grow, they started becoming global corporations. They started opening plants all over the world. And with that came the need of limiting their tax exposure. So for biopharmaceutical companies, it is key to be able to go to locations that are going to allow them the opportunity of minimizing those tax risks. And that's why you've seen Ireland, Singapore, at one point Puerto Rico, some of these markets come to the map of biopharmaceuticals industries looking for sites. So that's been key. Access to talent is also very important, highly skilled labor, strong research institutions, having the research infrastructure in your communities to be able to support developments, at least at the early stages in bio or life science industries. Easy of technology transfer. So now more these days we are seeing companies, before you had research and development operations in one place and then you had production in some other places. Now we are seeing more that this transfer of technology is becoming an important component in site selection for biopharmaceuticals. They are getting closer and closer. They want to facilitate the transfer of that technology, and they are bringing those operations together. The sites and spaces, they have very particular needs. You need vivariums, you need wet labs, you need things like that. So you need to have facilities that have all of these conditions. Availability of capital, this is an industry where you have a lot of very small players coming into, but very innovative players. And for the most part, the ones that are going to get the investment are those that are more advanced in the development of those new discoveries. The smaller ones are the ones that are struggling. So if you want to feed your entrepreneurial environment around biopharmaceuticals, life sciences, it is very important that you consider access to capital and incentivizing investors that would want to invest in these type of operations. And quality of life, of course. When you are attracting, you are dependent on workforce and you are dependent on highly skilled workforce. This is a very important component because you will rely more on the proximity to urban areas and to research institutions, educational networks. So I already spoke about all of these things. Important to biopharmaceuticals as well is understanding where in the life cycle that company is. So you'll find that companies at the very early stage of development in the research and development phase will want to be closer to where they have that research infrastructure. Some other companies that have evolved much more into already drug making, and those are companies that probably are going to be looking for locations in different parts of the world. And there are some other ones that are coupling their operations with in-field operations, where they already put those drugs into final dose forms, and they are ready to ship to their customers. The pharmaceutical industry is also dependent on some considerations around the different types of drugs. So generics are going to be very dependent on costs. So cost will be a very important driver. You have some other ones where vaccines, for example, are considered a national security risk. So you'll have a lot of those operations being done within the country borders. So those considerations are important when thinking about site location. So I already talked about that. Raleigh-Durham is the one good example of a place that has been able to grow and create a brand around biopharmaceuticals. And they've been able to anchor that with an industrial park, the Raleigh, the Research Triangle Industrial Park, but they've also been able to grow that industry with all the research infrastructure, the presence of 3 large universities in the area, and the efforts of other stakeholders at the state level and at different levels that are building that research and knowledge infrastructure. And of course, taxes. They've also have one of the lowest taxes, the corporate income tax, one of the lowest in the nation. So that's also been an attractive component there. So in looking at moving on from biopharmaceuticals and now moving on to a very different space, heavy industry. Heavy industry is highly capital intensive. Heavy industry has low to moderate demands for workforce, and they require more land. They have more needs in terms of building requirements, transportation, being able to have docks, being able to have trucks coming in, going out. And because of the intensive utility and infrastructure demand, these are also projects that take longer to develop. So they tolerate longer cycles in bringing in utilities, in providing the infrastructure. So this is a very typical project in the heavy industry. Of course, this is kind of the average project, but you'll see I've worked on projects with 800 megawatt electricity demand. I worked with projects where the capital investment is $500 million, but then they can hardly commit to 20 people. In terms of workforce. So you see all the spectrum, all the different mixes in the spectrum in heavy industry. But this is, for the most part, a typical project. So you see there, very intensive in utilities, very intensive in infrastructure. Those are the two key components for this type of projects. And when we think about utilities, we think about not only the traditional electricity, natural gas, water, wastewater, we are also talking about industrial gases. We are talking about, for example, the capacity to do direct discharge or direct withdrawal. So those two components are, and permitting, very important when you have emissions, when you have all of these considerations. Light industry has the same type of underlying needs of the heavy industry. But with light industry, the intensity at which that industry needs the utilities, so instead of the 20 megawatts, they are going to need 10 megawatts or lower than that. So you have those differences there. But again, they need a little bit of more labor comparatively, but they also need the utilities and the infrastructure, the logistics infrastructure that is needed to make these operations run. So here you have some examples of areas that have been successful over the past years. The Houston, the Gulf area has traditionally been a chemical area, but then you have some other ones that are coming onto the map of manufacturing, Florida surprisingly. And you have some other ones in the Rust Belt that are coming back to life, and that's good news. So I'm going to share with you, after looking at all of these, so you've seen I took this desktop level approach just to try to understand what this region is good at, what the data tells me. Again, putting boots on the ground, very important. But this first perception, because this is what's happening today, that we site selectors are coming and looking at regions at the desktop level and probably discarding a lot of very interesting regions just because we don't see it in the data. So that's an important consideration. So after I looked through the information that is available through different sources, economic development sources and some other ones on the Richmond area, these are some of the things that I see in terms of pros and in terms of areas for improvement. So in terms of pros, I think you have an advantage in terms of educational resources. That gives you also a good pool of talent for a lot of these industries that require highly skilled groups of people. You have a sizable labor market. Many times you are constrained in communities that have very good product, but you just don't have the people. And the community is not attractive enough to be able to bring in the people that you need for your operation. So I think you have very interesting things happening here. You are not too big, not too small, and it's still, I understand, getting from one point to the other of town, it's a 30-minute drive. So that makes it very comfortable when you look at other areas that are competing in those segments that may bring opportunities to you. strong entrepreneurial environment, all the startup infrastructure that is starting to come in place. I had the opportunity of witnessing that myself 3 weeks ago. I was here, and we went through some of these spaces that are being created. So that's a very neat component, and it's needed because a lot of the things that are going to be happening into the future are starting to happening at the startup level. And then acquisitions happen, and then bigger developments happen. But it's at that level that things are starting to happen, that innovation is starting to happen. So having that entrepreneurial environment and the focus that you are giving to that industry is an advantage, definitely. The vibrancy of the community, quality of life, I think you have that here. A lot of good changes happening in terms of changing activities in the downtown area, and a lot of good things happening in terms of entertainment and just being vibrant in terms of the communities and the opportunities. Relatively lower cost when you compare it to other areas that are competing in these segments where usually in biopharmaceuticals, for example, San Francisco or any of these areas that are just impossible to I don't know how people make it there. But anyway, so these are important considerations. The capacity of direct withdrawal and discharge. You have the James River, and about 4 years ago, I had the opportunity of working a project here that in the initial phase, they had a water demand of 8 million gallons per day. So actually, one of the top sites we were looking at was here in the Chesterfield County area. So you have that capacity, and I know that from experience from working on that project. You are at the crossroads of I-94 and I-64, and you have a great advantage in terms of logistics, transportations for segments like the food industry and others that depend highly on that transportation network. Proximity to major urban hubs. I think that's an important consideration in terms of market access. So you are very well located in that sense. You have to the south and to the north, very good access. Some areas for improvement. More information is needed in terms of the inland port. I don't know if you call it that way, but there is not much that you find out there. When you try to look and dig for data of types of developments that are happening or types of projects that are using the inland port, examples that can entice you to think this is a great opportunity in the Richmond area, that's lacking. I just wasn't able to find much out there on the inland port, and much of what I've learned about that operation, I've learned it over the last couple of days here. You have industries that the region is targeting for which still there is not strong specialization. So if you want to grow the specialization in those areas, you need to build the infrastructure to be able to support. Biopharmaceuticals, distribution is one of those examples. The possibility to leverage military personnel from the Hampton Roads area, I imagine that's something, and again, I'm talking from the desktop level. I haven't been able to explore much locally to understand what you are doing in terms of leveraging that resource that you have there. But again, excuse the ignorance if there is a lot of things happening around that area locally, but I would say that for thinking about aerospace and defense opportunities, you have a very good resource with having that infrastructure so close to you. And when looking at product, I think product offer for these different types of projects, and especially more so for biopharmaceuticals or for distribution or for some other areas, I feel you need more product for tapping into these industries. And for the product and the information that is put out there in terms of the product that you are offering for these industries, I feel there needs to be more information available to site selectors. Again, we are doing a lot at the desktop level these days in the initial stages. And having good information on good sites at the very beginning can put your community on the map, or can just have us discard it when probably you have very good opportunities in the community. So with that, I think I've reiterated along the conversation here The type of information that is available on the community is very important. These days, we rely more on desktop-level research at the beginning of the process, and we go to the public information sources. We also turn to what's available through the economic development websites, and so being able to build information that you cannot find on the public sources, but that you as a community can source and provide and make available, it's an important component to help us understand up-to-date developments, to help us understand the entrepreneurial activity, things that you won't be able to see in data that is lagging in time. One important consideration as well is the fact that we are still measuring industry concentration, and that will continue to be happening, and it will continue being key and important and critical, is measuring it in terms of the concentration you have of workers specialized in those industries. But I'm interested to see what types of transformations we'll need to make to be able to start measuring the concentration and our specialization when automation starts to take more prevalence in our operations. So how are we going to start measuring specialization when we are going to have more automated and probably workforce in some of those areas is going to decrease? So that's a question out there, is how we as communities not only start measuring our specialization, probably we are missing opportunities just because the way others perceive us, others perceive our communities is measured in terms of workforce specialization. But what if our community is a community that is evolving rapidly into becoming an automated processing community, one that is taking advantage of high technologies and is, so how do you measure your specialization there? So we need to start looking at creative ways, and I think this needs to happen also at the level where these indicators are created, is how do we start measuring specialization when workforce will be going through an adjusting period while we get all of these changes in place and we get more comfortable with the type of impacts we are going to start seeing. So, and I think communities also need to start leveraging your resources much more. I go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and I go to other sources that provide this information publicly and regularly, but at the same time, again, that's historical information. So the more you can do locally to be able to source your local information that is more up-to-date and that you can facilitate that to have it available to site selectors, to companies, to anybody evaluating your community is important. Leveraging your product portals, those portals where you have your site and building information and connecting that to specific industry sectors that you want to drive, and probably providing a value proposition for those business sectors and how those sites help feed into opportunities for that sector, and providing the utility. I know providing utility information is sensitive, but being able to provide some sort of information that gives a better sense on the opportunities that companies can find in your communities. So with that, I got to 0, and I've been running here trying to get time for questions, but I did much better than yesterday. Yesterday, I ate into time for questions, so I hope we have some time for those this afternoon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Catalina. I'm Andy Proctor with Atlantic Real Estate Capital. I'm joined up here with Vince Nader with Kiter. We're going to facilitate the question and answer session. I just have one quick question to start off with. You know, when we're watching these national searches on the news and you know, like the Amazon HQ2, all you hear about is incentives. Mm-hmm. Does your data search at the beginning include, you know, what have municipalities given in the way of incentives in the past to other companies, or is that just further down the line? Yeah, that happens, and that's very dependable on the types of projects. You want to see? See. On the types of projects, more
projects like the Amazon project are more dependent on incentives. But there are some other projects for which those incentives come later, or the focus on looking at incentives comes later in the process. For example, if you look at heavy industry manufacturing, but let me talk about heavy industry that has been my focus over the past years. For heavy industry, when you think about a project that has a 800 megawatt demand, what's important is to find a place that can provide that capacity and where you have that infrastructure. So that comes first. Finding that site, finding the site that has the providers that can bring that infrastructure to place. Once you have that in place, then you start thinking about the other components. Okay. But yeah, it's just dependable on we don't look, at the beginning for incentives. That's not our driver. You need to find, we have something that we say as site selector is incentives make a good location better. But incentives don't make a bad location look good. So you need to find the right location, and then you start talking about incentives.
Thank you.
We're supposed to have a couple of folks with
There
microphones.
should be some mics walking around.
So if you do have a question, raise your hand so that Andy and I don't have to ask all your questions.
Okay.
Right there. There's...
Right here.
That's a mic?
This is the weirdest microphone I've ever seen. Okay. How much are renewable energy resources impacting site selection nowadays, or is that a little overblown?
It's becoming very, very important. Companies are starting to look much more at the possibility of having those renewable sources. For example, this 800 megawatt project I worked on, they didn't want to work with an electric provider that was coal-based, that had a coal-powered facility. They wanted to work with one that had moved on from that. So definitely that's starting to become critical. Companies don't want to be working. They are starting to more into more cleaner technologies and renewables, and that's going to be much more important as we move forward and infrastructure starts coming into place with renewable options.
Along that same vein, when you're out looking at these competing areas, the utilities, will they consider nuclear now any more favorably than they would have 10 years ago?
I haven't worked on any project that has considered nuclear, and I haven't seen that proposition come to the table from any community, to tell you the truth. So yes, I haven't seen it in the equation when...
In Lynchburg, Virginia, they're making pocket nuclear reactors that can power communities of 10,000 people.
Wow.
And they're much like the reactors they put on nuclear submarines. So we have this ability. It's right here in Virginia. We can export it. Is anybody making any sales out there? Because this is top
Right.
end of the utility provided scale.
Yeah, I think what happened in Japan back in 2011 scared a lot of people, and you saw Europe just wanting to walk away from that. And I've never seen in my time doing site selection anybody come in and telling us we want to look at nuclear, and any community bringing that as part of the solution. But thank you for the information. I didn't know that.
Hey, it's obvious that the data selection it's the first part. It's very important. Have you seen any examples of communities or municipalities where the private industry and the public sector is working together to shape the data that's out there?
I know many communities, and again, I may be ignorant, very ignorant about what's happening in Richmond, and I would love to learn more about your community. But I've known smaller communities that they just annually, for example, they have employer interviews. Employer surveys where they measure how much hiring they've done, what factors are coming into play when making business decisions, when hiring people. So these are things that are happening in smaller communities. I'm assuming it's happening in places like Richmond. But many times this data stays at the local level. They don't publish this data. When we go on site selection projects, sometimes they bring that to the table. Oh, the survey that we conduct, and we have to ask, can you let us see the survey? And it's at those moments that these things come into the conversation. So if you are capable, I know there are communities that are already doing that, making those available and making them readable and tying that into the industry segments that you want to attract would be an important consideration as to how you present that information and how you leverage that effort.
Okay, thank you. Have any other questions from the audience?
Is there I'll ask one. Is there a place that folks that are sitting in this room that are developing and investing in real estate, et cetera, you say there's site selection happening and we don't know about it. Mm-hmm. Is there a place that we're able to find out who's looking at us so that we can maybe tailor our decisions in this room and going forward so that we can try and attract those folks or at least get off of the desk audit and get looked at a bit deeper?
Well, that's the difficult part. You have groups of site selectors. You have companies more these days making that initial phase of research into communities and coming to the site selector when they are advanced in the process and probably just bringing a short list of communities for us to evaluate. So you are just having different people looking around, so there is not one source where you would be able to go and see who's been looking at my community. And especially because it's just individuals or corporations doing that exercise, so that's not something that is published officially or publicly anywhere. So yeah, I don't know of any source that you would have to know that.
You mentioned in your presentation that one of the downsides of the desktop research is that sometimes the data is lagging or it's old. You also said it's not a good public source for the service sector. Is there something else the service sector uses instead of the desktop search as kind of the first look?
I haven't been able to find one data set or one source of information that would measure the service sector at the level that you find information for the industrial sector, where you can go deeper into the 6-digit NAICS codes and try to look for details into what specific industries are having activity. There is a service survey that I was able to find. I believe it's the U.S. Census Bureau or one of those that is the one that puts that together. But it's very high level. They just have a list of sectors there, so it's very difficult just to look through and try to understand specifically what type of sector activity. So they have it grouped into higher level activities. So just trying to understand specifically what type of service activity is the one that is growing and is differentiating one region over the other. I haven't been able to find that source yet.
So if you were working with a service sector company, is there some other steps would you skip over that and go to the next step? Or?
Well, I think we would rely much more into just going the traditional way of reaching out to the communities based on the target area that company or that project has, going to the communities, requests for information, and be able to sift through the information that way.
Okay. I think we have a question out here.
Yes. Without giving up any of your proprietary information or showing favoritism, when you look at the data that's available in the Richmond metro area from the top-down look, how does that compare to other areas in the country as far as quality and quantity of the information so that we do make the first cut of the cards and not be left behind?
Right. Very good question. I think when it comes to the public information sources, everybody's on the same place because the U.S. Census Bureau is just having one set of data that covers the entire country, or the Labor Bureau. So in that sense, we are all getting the same type of information. I think where you can make a difference is in, for example, the economic development organizations and the type of information that is available through those sources. We are looking much more at the economic development partnerships or alliances websites these days for information on properties, for information that is more about the local community, the local workforce that we are not able to find through public information sources. So I've seen communities that are capitalizing on streamlining their websites and really focusing on the type of information that we site selectors look for. There are some that you just have product information, information on workforce, so they make it very, very clear to go to the pieces of information that we need to look at. They provide very good information on property, due diligence packages for those sites that have gone through some sort of readiness process. So I think there is where you start finding differences in communities, some that are capitalizing more on their resources, online resources, to be able to provide that information, and revamping those resources to be able to make them and convert them into very powerful tools for them to bring businesses to their communities. So I think that's an area where you can make a very good difference. I've also seen communities starting to use technologies to be able to provide a better picture on sites, for example. So a lot of them are using drone technology to showcase their signature sites, and they post those videos on their websites, and you can really get a view and a sense of how those sites look like. So a lot of that's happening out there with drone technology. I've also seen communities that have put together digitally renderings of how a site can transform into a production site. And it's mind-blowing. I saw it with a community in North Carolina that they had a site, and they started the video with the site, the raw site. You don't see much. As soon as they start bringing in and explaining how they can, and they've already worked at the county council level with pre-approvals and discussions already around some of the infrastructure transformations that they can bring to the table, and you start seeing all of these changes coming on the screen, and then the rendering of the building. It's mind-blowing to be able to see, sometimes to see a raw piece of land, regardless of how much due diligence you've done on it. It's just very difficult sometimes to visualize your facility there. But seeing something like this is transformative. It really tilts the balance and provides you with very impactful visual information there.
Any other questions from the audience? Yep, another one right here.
Over the past few years, there's been a lot of chatter about the possibility of either a new baseball stadium or a new coliseum or a new arena to replace our current coliseum. Would those have any impact at all on a site selector as far as wanting to choose Richmond?
Well, I don't think the site selector will put it out there. I need my community or the community to have the baseball. But as much as that could contribute to your quality of life, those are important investments. I think that goes to the quality of life impact. I'm trying to think about communities that have, Greenville, South Carolina, where you just see that, every little thing that they've added to town has just made that town exploded with not only opportunities, but also with the perception of quality of life. So the baseball stadium, being they are a division, I don't know much about baseball, so help me here. A Division 2, they are something for the Boston Red Sox. So they have the second division team or the third division team, something like that in town. And that drives a lot of people, a lot of events, company, BMW, a lot of things that they just use that opportunity that they have there. So it's anchored a lot of opportunity in town. So I think that as much as that helps support your quality of life and you are able to provide a business case for how much that will help, but I haven't seen a project. Projects look in general for quality of life. And that can mean many things from one community to the other. So yeah, that's an evaluation that you have to make internally. But yeah, anything that contributes to quality of life, and of course is going to be much more critical for certain projects than others. There are facilities that can be out in the countryside, and they are better left alone. They don't need to have a lot of things happening in their surrounding area, just because of the nature of their operation. But for those where quality of life is an important, it's a top component of their decision-making process, I would say, that needs to be accounted into your evaluation.
When you're looking at a high level at an area, like the Richmond area is made up of the city of Richmond, multiple counties, are you able to determine the level of cooperation amongst those different entities that make up that area?
It's perception. So it's sometimes it's very easy to, not only at that level where you see how the information is put together or how much is talked about, the partnerships between company, universities, or how much that's presented through these sources, but also it's very telling when you come on site visits and you sit down with people from the community to have your utility interviews, your infrastructure, talk about engineering, talk about those things. All the communities, I haven't met one that doesn't sit at the table and says, oh, we work together very well. But I've been at communities where they tell you that, and then the people from the electric utility comes in, then the other ones comes in, and then they start introducing themselves. They say, oh, nice to meet you. And you just wonder, is this the first time they are meeting? Is that working well? So those things are very telling. Sometimes it's those little details you don't think of that say a lot about your communities. So those are things that need to be looked at. But at the desktop level, just the information that is put out there is also very telling. How much you are able to talk about the partnerships between private and public sector, or university and private sector, or the state level organization and how you cooperate with them as a regional economic development organization. Those type of things, if you cannot provide that information or back it up with examples, testimonials, things of that nature, you can perceive that. But again, it's perception. Right. And it just may be that those sources are just lacking putting that information out there.
Well, regardless of what the data says, I promise you Richmond works really well together with all the different areas.
Do you know each other?
You have my word. You have my word. No. Any other? We
have one right here.
How do you use social media in the data mine?
Not much these days. That's interesting. Very interesting. We use it more for the usual connecting and learning a lot of things that are happening in the communities, announcements. That's information that is coming. That's a good point. Announcements, for example. Learning where communities are getting, or from where communities are getting investment. I think that's one of those things for which social media has been, everybody wants to brag about the new company they brought into town. So that's going to be there on LinkedIn or on Twitter. So that's what's been useful for, to keep pace with those changes. Sometimes those announcements through LinkedIn come first than an official announcement, or they just come write up, but you haven't seen the official announcement. You get to see it on LinkedIn. So it gives you a sense of what industries are coming in line to the community. But that just happens because I go and check it and I make the exercise, but not because I've made it part of my process. Look at U.S. Census Bureau, and second, look at my LinkedIn to see what's happening. But very good point. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Okay.
Well, the 10th Annual Commonwealth Commercial Forum did want to say thank you, Catalina. We appreciate it.
Thank you very
boy.
much. You have your...
So that's a gift for you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of information.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catalina.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been very exciting to be here. And I hope to have the opportunity to learn more about the Richmond area and hopefully to bring another project to the area in the near future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to invite Rob Roseborough with Marsh McClenahan up here to wrap it up and get us to the refreshments.
Do you need these?
Thank you, Andy. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rob Roseborough, Business Development Manager for the Richmond Division of Marsh McLennan Mid-Atlantic. I have the dubious distinction of being your last barrier to the bar outside. With that in mind, I will now attempt to set a new world land speed record for closing remarks. Marsh McLennan Agency, or MMA, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Marsh McLennan, the world's largest insurance broker. MMA provides risk management, insurance placement services, employee health benefits consulting, and surety bonding to middle market companies throughout the United States and abroad. While we have a devoted local approach, we are privileged to be able to tap into the deep resources and capabilities within Big Marsh for all our clients' specific needs, world-class local touch. Catalina, thank you for sharing your insight and expertise. We hope you'll come back soon. Well done. And we are delighted to have been a part of this great event for the last several years and would like to thank Commonwealth Commercial Partners, LINGERFELT Commonwealth Partners for once again putting together another great program, as well as our other sponsors, Kiter, Greater Richmond Partnership, Sauer Properties, Baskervill, Troutman Sanders, Atlantic Real Estate Capital, Wells Fargo, and West Creek. Lastly, and most importantly, we would like to thank all of you in attendance for your continued support and patronage. And with that, we invite you to the reception area for a little refreshment and a chance to mingle. Thank you very much.